What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another installment of the best armies in Warhammer 40k. This is the weekly video series where we talk about undefeated lists from GTs and other large events for the past weekend, and this one is for the weekend of February 10th and 11th, 2024, and it is the first week that we're really seeing the new metagame come to fruition. We saw the data slate update hit last week. We didn't really see too many changes, and not too many events used it, so we didn't have too much to talk about, but this week most of the events of the weekend did, and so we are going to be seeing some of the new contenders in the metagame come to the fore. Now, we didn't have too many events to talk about, but as we move on to a metagame breakdown here, we do see that Astra Militarum have come out as the big front runner of the weekend, and this is a little bit of an interesting development. Astra Militarum did get a nerf in the data slate. They saw their Manticores, a staple of Militarum armies, and I think a unit that will remain to be seen in Militarum armies moving on to the future, see a points increase, but no other changes to Militarum besides a slight buff to their orders that allowed them to issue orders when they disembarked transports or set up out of reserve. A kind of nice quality of life change, but I don't know if it was too transformative. However, I think that the big thing that we are seeing happen is that some of the biggest predators of Militarum builds have been nerfed. We saw armies, especially armies that were very resilient against their style of indirect fire, be extremely toxic to Astra Militarum and really prevent Militarum from doing well. And those armies, especially armies like Chaos Space Marines, have been nerfed significantly and aren't as big of a contender in the metagame. And I think that may be allowing Militarum to come back in a big way. So very interesting development there. I think definitely one that surprised me quite a bit because I did not expect to see Astra Militarum doing so well, and it will be interesting to see if that continues on into the future. Astra Militarum did take down the Beachhead Brawl, the largest event of the weekend, a major level event, alongside the Ottawa Winter Open, and have an undefeated record at the Brighton GT. Also at the Brighton GT, we saw Adepta Sororitas with a 5-0 record, and the Grand Onslaught was actually won by some interesting factions, both Art of War players, Jack Harpster and John Lennon, playing World Eaters and Tyranids, respectively. We'll talk about both of those lists as we move on, and we'll talk about some other interesting factions, Thousand Sons and Dark Angels, both with undefeated results this weekend too. So not too many events to discuss today, but we do have some interesting lists, and I wonder if we're going to be seeing these factions in the future, at least factions like World Eaters and Thousand Sons, which did see some debuffs in the data slate, and whether, with a larger sample size, these factions will continue to do well. With that, let's dive into the lists and start by talking about Astra Militarum. Now, we did see Astra Militarum with relatively similar lists take down Beachhead Brawl and the Ottawa Winter Open, but we're actually going to talk about the list that went X, O, and 1 today, mostly because it's super rad. This was at the Brighton GT, where Luke Walsh took his army to an undefeated record, 4-0 and 1. He didn't win the event, and he did not receive all wins, but he did not lose any games. Luke's list was led by a combination of units that we're going to be seeing a lot into the future. Lord Solar Leontis plus a platoon command squad. The big benefit there is that Lord Solar can join into a unit alongside the platoon command squad and make use of their Master Vox to broadcast his 3 orders that he can issue to any Astra Militarum unit a greater distance. You can attach both of those into most of the Imperial Guard infantry, and I think they're both going to be jumping into the Death Corps of Krieg unit that we see in the army as well. Those Kriegers are a little bit tougher to kill. They do have a meta pack, which is kind of nice to just keep Lord Solar's bodyguards alive for a little bit longer. We then also see a Regimental Engineer alongside a big unit of 20 Cadian shock troopers, a small 3-man Bulgrin squad, which can dive into a Chimera to add a little bit of mid-board control, a little bit of fire support from a field ordnance battery carrying 2 bombast field guns, alongside an immense amount of armor. All the Armored Company fans out in the audience right now are going to be excited about this build because it is rocking 2 Rogaldorn battle tanks plus a Leman Russ Exterminator to buff them up with +1 AP at whatever it shoots at with its autocannons, and that is all in service of a Shadow Sword. Now, the Shadow Sword is the Imperial Guard Super Heavy rocking a massive volcano cannon. This thing is a D3+1 blast shot, strength 24, AP 5, 12 damage cannon that gains devastating wounds when targeting monsters or vehicles. That's also on top of the enormous number of additional attacks that this thing gets, with rocking 5 sets of twin heavy bolters and 4 las cannons. Just an immense amount of firepower from this thing, and the benefit that we have from taking it alongside Lord Solar Leontis is that Lord Solar can buff it with his orders. Because its Volcano Cannon is heavy, it can potentially remain stationary if it has line of sight to something, and then also gain +1 to hit from Lord Solar ordering it. That potentially puts it down to hitting on 2s if that one Scout Sentinel that is also in the list has line of sight to the target and uses his recon ability on it. He can then reroll its 1s to hit as well. So it can potentially get ridiculously consistent shots with that enormous Volcano Cannon that is wounding like 90% of the game on 2s. To round out the list real quick, we also had a Calidus Assassin in order to score some points. No Gaunt's Ghosts in this list, a unit that we see in most Astra Militarum lists for their ability to jump into reserve, but today we are rocking the Calidus Assassin, which is totally fair. That Regimental Engines here is also going to be buffing it up by healing it and giving it a 4+ invulnerable save, which is fairly useful, although it does have a 2+ base armor save, so not super relevant in every situation. Now, the interesting thing about these Super Heavies in Astra Militarum is their lack of the towering keyword. They are Titanic units, but they don't benefit from the towering rulings that Knights do. And I did look up the Brighton GT's event rules. They were running WTC terrain at their event. There was some consideration after we saw these Militarum Super Heavies do fairly well at the Las Vegas Open, that the use of player-placed terrain in that format allows them to get better positions to start on the table. They can protect themselves in turn 1, and then ensure that they have solid lines of fire at least through the middle of the table. But WTC terrain is, generally speaking, much more dense and much more toxic to these enormous Super Heavies, which makes it all the more interesting that Luke Walsh was able to go undefeated with a list including this thing. I think one thing that does benefit it is the massive number of other tanks in the army. Luke can push forward and expose all of the Rogel Dorns and Leman Russ alongside the Shadow Sword and really overload his opponent's ability to actually kill them. Most lists only have a limited amount of anti-tank firepower, which is maybe enough to kill one Rogel Dorn or maybe seriously cripple the Shadow Sword in one turn, but not enough to do both. And if you can't answer all of these threats at once, they're going to be able to punish you super duper hard. While I do think largely we are going to be seeing more artillery-focused armies out of Astra Militarum in the future, I think it is interesting to talk about these one-off builds that are rocking the larger, more interesting units like these big Super Heavies, which is why we're talking about Luke's list today. Speaking of which, we can stay with Brighton GT and talk about the actual winner of the event, that being Rob LeBeau. Rob was running a list led by Morven Val, as well as a Palatine with the Blade of St. Eleanor that could jump into a Dominion squad, which could embark into a Sororitas Rhino, giving it its scout move. We also had, interestingly, the Demonifuge, a unit that we don't see played very often. This is the unit composed of Ephriel Stern and Kaiganil, her Harlequin buddy, and this unit together is a pretty impressive profile. They have Deep Strike, Fights First, and Lone Operative, allowing them to act as a fairly useful utility unit, and they're difficult to kill, especially from enemy units that aren't particularly resilient. They have a grand total of 10 attacks with Fights First, which altogether can really clip out enemies that are trying to get too close to them. They also have the potential to do a little bit of a smite, doing some mortal wounds on a failed leadership test to an enemy within 12 inches, and they're able to heroically intervene for 0 CP, a super useful ability in Adepta Sororitas, who can also combo heroic interventions with suffering and sacrifice, making it possible that you can heroically intervene a unit, engage a bunch of their models, then force those models to attack the Demonifuge instead of the more valuable sisters that they actually wanted to attack. In addition to their usefulness as just a lone operative unit for only 80 points, which is fairly reasonable within the faction, and having Deep Strike, so allowing them to jump into a table corner or something to complete a secondary, does make them a fairly useful unit. Moving on, we had those transports that carry around the Palatine and her squad, including 2 Immolators and 2 Sororitas Rhinos. We also had 2 units of Arcoflagellants that could dive into the Rhinos as well, 2 units of 2 Crusaders to act as utility, alongside 2 units of Sisters Repentia, a Retributor squad that is another potential target for that Palatine to join into, 2 Seraphim squads to score secondary objectives, and a Calidus Assassin to act as another Deep Striker, alongside Paragon Warsuits for Morven Val to join into, and a Battle Cannon equipped Castigator. Overall, this list is largely what we've been seeing from Adepta Sororitas recently, but the inclusion of some interesting characters and units like the Retributor squad that we haven't seen in super long, but is able to embark into an Immolator, disembark, and get the benefit of fire support, making it a fairly effective anti-tank unit with those rerolls to wound, does make the list fairly unique. Moving on from there, let's talk about the large event of the weekend, the Beachhead Brawl. Now, the Beachhead Brawl was topped by Astra Militarum, who did take first place, but it had 2 undefeated players. Both Martin Cooper, who won the event with the Imperial Guard, and J. Baroon, who ended up going undefeated with a Dark Angels build. Now, I was a little bit surprised to see Dark Angels on the roster today. I know the power of their supplement is fairly questionable, but this list was only really taking Azrael as a token Dark Angels member. This was an Ironstorm Spearhead that was incredibly interesting, with a lot of super duper unique picks. Azrael was in there to give the army a little bit of additional CP. We also saw a combi weapon lieutenant with Master of the Machine War to allow nearby vehicles to advance or fall back and still shoot, and 2 Tech Marines with the other 2 powerful enhancements from the detachment. One with Target Augury Web to give lethal hits in an aura, and one with Adept of the Omnissiah to blank incoming damage on vehicles. We then saw those buffing 2 Gladiator Lancers, 2 Redemptor Dreadnoughts, a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike, and last but certainly not least, a Stormraven gunship. Now, the Stormraven gunship is a really interesting include. This thing is tough to kill, especially alongside Adept of the Omnissiah and additional CP from Azrael in order to unlock more uses of Armor of Contempt. It has a baked-in -1 damage effect, and if it needs to, it can turn off its hover jets, go into jet mode, and ignore a lot of terrain for line of sight, making it very good against opposing artillery that just wants to stay out of line of sight and hide for the majority of the game. Now, those vehicles were also protected by a Ravenwing Dark Shroud, which can additionally help keep the Stormraven gunship alive by providing its stealth. It also helps the big bricky units in the center, like the Redemptor Dreadnoughts and the Gladiator Lancers, making the entire list extremely difficult to kill. The infantry in the list were also a super interesting include. We had a Scout Squad, which isn't too surprising, giving the list a little bit of utility, but we also had a 10-model Sternguard Veteran Squad. These guys equipped with combi weapons, giving them anti-infantry 4+. The updated Sternguard Veteran Squad can buff that as well by re-rolling Wounds of 1 against the Oath of Moment target, giving them a pretty reasonable chance to score those devastating wounds. Now, there is the potential that we could also see Azrael join into that unit, giving them a 4+ invulnerable save, as well as sustained 1 on their weapons, so they could be potentially re-rolling a bunch of hit rolls, getting additional sustains, and then wounding those on 4s, re-rolling against heavy enemy infantry units. That allows them to burn through units like Terminators and other similarly statted heavy infantry fairly quickly. There is also a little bit of fun synergy between those Redemptor Dreadnoughts and the Stormraven. It can carry a Dreadnought in its bay. I think it has a grappling hook in the back that's supposed to actually carry the Dreadnought around, and it is able to actually carry a Redemptor Dreadnought to the battlefield and then drop it off, which is a hilarious image, given the fact that a Redemptor Dreadnought is basically the same size as a Stormraven gunship. We could also put those Sternguard in the Stormraven gunship as well, in order to protect them on the first turn from enemy artillery and give them an outlet to jump out later on in the game as well. Overall, very interesting and unique take on the Ironstorm Spearhead. Not one that we see too often. Typically, these armies are focused much more heavily on the big tanks and less so on the infantry, but the inclusion of Sternguard Veterans, a unit that we have not seen basically since they were nerfed pretty heavily outside of the index, makes the list super interesting. And that moves us on to the Kairos Dynasty GT. Now, the name of this GT was very appropriate because the exemplar of Tzeentch, Kairos Fateweaver himself, would have been happy that it was won by none other than the Tzeentchian cult Chaos Space Marines, Thousand Suns. Ryan Kerrer took down the event with the boys in blue, running Ahriman on foot, an Exalted Sorcerer with Lord of Forbidden Lore, an Infernal Master with the Athenaean Scrolls to generate some additional Cabal points, as long as he's on the battlefield, Magnus the Red, and a Thousand Suns Terminator Sorcerer with the Umbralific Crystal. That guy was joined into a big unit of 10 Scarab Occult Terminators. This is a unit that we haven't seen in a little while. Thousand Suns lists moved away from Scarab Occult Terminators more recently because they are an immensely expensive brick of points, coming in at almost 600 points once you calculate the cost of the Sorcerer himself. That said, with all of the benefits that the Cult of Magic detachment gives to especially Inferno bolt weapons, like the Inferno Combi Bolters that the Scarab Occult Terminators are carrying, it definitely can do an immense amount of damage. And with the ability to move multiple times and get movement bonuses from Magnus, Deep Strike onto the table, and then potentially pick up and Deep Strike again thanks to the Umbralific Crystal, these guys can jump around basically wherever they want. That makes it very difficult to stop them from getting to you, and once they get to you, they can wombo themselves out to do some absolutely insane damage. In addition to that, we also had a big 10-man Rubric squad with Warp Flamers, probably for Ahriman to join into, alongside 2 smaller 5-man Rubric squads for the other characters to hop into as well. Picking up the rear was a unit of Zangor Enlightened to score some objective points, and a Mutalith Vortex Beast to increase the range of the Army's Kabbalistic Rituals, and also just acts as a big, relatively difficult to kill stompy monster that could wander around the table, protecting itself with an invulnerable save and feel no pain, and threatening its opponent with its enormous railgun laser beam weapon. It's cool to see Thousand Sons doing well, even after the slight changes that they got in the update. I do think that they were another faction, potentially alongside Astra Militarum, that was hurt pretty significantly by Chaos Space Marines. They had very little that they could do in that matchup, and Eldar wasn't cakewalk either, especially Eldar lists that were focused on artillery and Night Spinners could be very difficult for Thousand Sons, and those armies being less of an issue in the metagame, although they have much less easy access to their demon allies, which they use to score secondaries. Now, we'll move on to the last event of the weekend, although we do have 2 armies to talk about. Both of these from Team Art of War players. This was Grand Onslaught 7, which was won by Jack Harpster playing World Eaters. It's cool to see World Eaters on the table after the changes to their Favorite of Khorne, and this list has left Favorite of Khorne at home, not electing to take it now that it can only be used once per game. The list was led by Angron and Lord Invocatus, only those 2 characters, alongside a unit of 10 Jackals to lock in objectives with their objective control ability, and an absolute bevy of 8-bound. 1 unit of 3 standard 8-bound, and 3 units of Exalted 8-bound, 1 of 6 and 2 of 3. That was backed up by 2 units of Chaos Spawn in order to add a little bit of utility to the army, alongside a Khorne Lord of Skulls. This guy with his newly reduced points value is an absolute powerhouse, and I think we are going to be seeing him a lot more often moving on into the future in Chaos armies. The Lord of Skulls does give you a little bit of that dice manipulation that we were used to on Favorite of Khorne rolls by allowing you to add or subtract 2 Favorite of Khorne dice for each unit that the Lord of Skulls destroyed in the previous battle round. It's not that difficult to destroy things with this guy because his damage output is also fairly extreme. Jack Harpster's version was running a Demon Gore Cannon, an 18-inch range D6 blast weapon that fires a Demolisher Shell at strength 14 AP4 for D6 plus 2 damage. He was also running a Skull Hurler, a 60-inch range 2d6 shot weapon, interestingly not blast, so it can fire into melee at strength 14 AP3 for a flat 3 damage. That's a lot of anti-tank shooting that basically every army has to be worried about, but in melee it also hits at strength 16 AP4 for 8 damage, or a sweep attack at strength 8 AP2 for 2 damage with 15 swings. This guy is an absolute powerhouse both in shooting and in melee, and you do basically just have to deal with him, otherwise he will slowly attrition your army down. A lot of times you have to overcommit to deal with the Lord of Skulls, and Angron will sweep in order to clean things up, or vice versa. You might have to kill Angron to stop him killing your most valuable units, and if you do so, you will have to expose your units that could potentially kill with the Lord of Skulls, and that allows the Lord of Skulls to win in the late game. One big downside of the Lord of Skulls is its ponderous movement. The model itself is physically extremely large and a little bit difficult to move around the table, susceptible to being body blocked, but with only one of them on the table and with relatively fast 8-bound, especially alongside Invocatus' scout moves on those units, I don't think that's as much of a consideration because you're not body blocking your own army as much, and your opponent is going to be forced so far back to not die to the 8-bound that the Lord of Skulls will have free reign, at least in the beginning of the game. It's cool to see a bit of a combined arms coming out of World Eaters. Not all melee now, but the Lord of Skulls adds a lot of shooting to the army as well, and we're not just seeing Lord of Skulls or just 8-bound being taken, we're seeing a little bit of a combination of the two, which I think gives them a little bit more of a well-rounded look than we saw them previously. And that moves us on to our last army of the day. That's going to be John Lennon at the same event, who came second at Grand Onslaught, but also with a 5-0 record playing Tyranids. This was an invasion fleet detachment rocking a Hive Tyrant with adaptive biology to give it a feel no pain once it takes damage, a Neuro Tyrant alongside Old One Eye. The army was very focused on Carnifexes and the combination with Screamer Killers. It was running 2 Neurolictors alongside 2 Screamer Killers, so in the command phase of the Tyranids turn, you could potentially force 2 Battle Shock checks with the Neurolictors themselves, then in your shooting phase, force 2 additional Battle Shock checks with the Screamer Killer. Whatever fails those Battle Shock checks, if it's within 12 inches of the Neurolictor, then gets +1 to be wounded from the rest of the Tyranid army, which makes the 2 Exocrines, Maleceptor, and 2 Carnifexes that join in with Old One Eye much more dangerous against those units. Not to mention the Screamer Killers themselves, which come in with 10 Strength 10, AP2, 3 damage attacks. Assuming these guys are actually able to get to the fight, which is a little bit tough because they're not the fastest units in the world, they will actually do a ton of damage against Battle Shock enemies that are affected by the Neurolictor aura. Once that whole combination is assembled, this Tyranid army can actually do a surprising amount of damage. And with 3 units of Gargoyles and a Biovore in the back in order to score, it has the potential to be gaining gaining an absolute ton of points while it does so. Very cool combination coming out of John Lennon today. I really like to see a little bit of innovation with those Screamer Killers in there. They're definitely an okay profile at 145 points. I think maybe leaving a little bit to be desired, either in the speed, resilience, or output category. We could probably turn the dial a little bit to the right on one of those strengths, but either way, they are still a useful force multiplier to the army, especially alongside the inclusion of those Neurolictors. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about them, if you have any surprises after this data slate coming down. I think Astra Militarum doing well and maybe being one of the front runners of the metagame moving on into the new season definitely was something that I was surprised to see, but it does make sense once we consider that some of their worst matchups have been nerfed. And with that, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.